So, this is going to be an interesting conversation around delegation. I think instead of me defining what delegation is, we can also have everyone introduce themselves and maybe also give a short definition of what they think delegation is. Starting with Arnold, who was our presenter before.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to introduce myself because hopefully you just saw me. So I guess delegation is a very interesting property of DAOs. Delegates, in terms of how people think about them, they perceive them as high context individuals, and they are sort of granted this superpower to be able to vote on a bunch of users' behalves. And I think that's a really powerful thing, but there is this also growing narrative in the ecosystem that, paid delegates, are they necessary? And for me, I would probably present the contrarian opinion where I think if delegation is working properly, the DAO should already have built-in mechanisms to distribute rewards to people who are performing the delegate activity, as opposed to having a paid delegation program. Yeah, stop with that.
All right. Great intro.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Sinkas. I'm representing L2Beat, and L2Beat is a public source, public goods open source company. But we also happen to be delegates, and we are active in some of the most prominent Ethereum L2's DAOs like Optimism, Arbitrum, and some other protocol related, for example, Uniswap and some others. We are delegates, so I'm gonna be on the opposite side of the spectrum with this argument. I think it's a lot of work to be delegate and do the work properly. And although in theory the incentives are there for you to do the job and you have power over the protocol and everything, in reality it's a bit different. But happy to have this panel and chat it out.
Hello. So I am here contributor for Marinate. I am from a perspective of the practical use of delegation. As a DAO, we are seeking for a way how to get a more active community, and thinking delegation could be one way to get some experts in the field to really communicate their opinion and help DAO to really be better. That's and that's where we are standing now to start with that experiment.
And I think that's a great place to start from our conversation, because Marinate is actively building out the delegation plugin for Realms. And this is in a hope to increase participation, or is it to get more opinions? What is the core reason you're building towards that? And then I think it'd be interesting to get your opinions coming back in this direction.
Yes, that's the both points that I think that you said. That's our hope that to get some better feedback, as I mentioned as well in the presentation. The staking is pretty niche and expert oriented field where we are trying to improve our yield for the stakers. We would like to utilize the power of DAO to build it in a better way for whole DAO would grow. And with that, when we check for our forum discussions, there is pretty low active users that would somehow follow and share with us some feedback that helps in going forward with the DAO or the company. And we hope that delegation could help to put the more power for a user that would be more engaged to be actively participate.
So yeah, to sync us, in your experience, do you see that you're getting more expert opinion from the different DAOs that have active delegate programs?
Yeah, so I think firstly, the whole discussion should be about whether a DAO should have direct democracy versus representative democracy, have delegates versus not have delegates, and token holders can just vote directly. This has been a question in politics, ever since ancient Greece. And I think in blockchain, what is unique about democracy and DAOs and voting and delegation is that it can be liquid, right? So let's say in municipal level or regional level, national, international, whatever, and you have representative democracy where you elect an official and they go represent your interests in the parliament or in the European Union or wherever. And what that means is you elect them and then they have a term, let's say 4 years for the government, and you cannot change that. And they theoretically hire people. We see a lot of nepotism. Theoretically they should hire people that are familiar with the domain that they're hiring them for, but that's not always the case. Contrary, on the blockchain, what you could do is you could have a representative democracy, but it could change who your representative is based on the topic at hand. So this is, for me, the most interesting thing that we should be discussing. When it comes to whether a DAO should have or not have delegates and should be rather a direct democracy, I think it has to do mostly with the size and the security aspects of it. So if you're a small local community that's just doing a bunch of work, handling a little money and treasury and trying to make decisions, I think direct voting is okay. But the more bigger you have, let's say you have a big protocol, a big blockchain that's securing billions of dollars, and you have to take initiatives to grow that, then representative democracy will, as we'll discuss probably going forward, is kind of like the best approach, at least from the ones that we have right now. But there are many caveats to that. And one of them has to do with domain knowledge, governance, apathy, token holders. If there's a big protocol and you have, let's say, 10 tokens, and there's delegates out there with millions of voting power, as you showcased in the graph earlier, you don't participate simply because you don't make a difference, or at least in your mind, right? You're thinking, what am I going to change?
Yeah, actually, in some recent research, so Andy Hall from A6 and Z, he's a researcher at that lab. He recently did an empirical study, and they found that I think 30% of small token holders, they actually use representative democracy. They delegate their tokens because they have that same affiliation. I think one of the points that you made was actually spot on. Depending on the size of the DAO, that's when different types of programs need to happen. And I think in the stage where we're at now, or maybe in regards to the size, like as you're going from small to medium to large, in that sort of transition from medium to large, hitting quorum is like super important. And there are many cases in quite large DAOs that have huge treasuries where they don't hit quorum almost every 1 or 2 months because of this sort of we just don't know. We don't fully understand why they have that, even when they do have delegate programs, which is something we need to sort of explore further. And I think the paid aspect of the moment is it's more of an incentive to reach quorum than it is to perform a duty. And I think some of the things that we need to do as an industry is I've got nothing against, I think delegation is super important. What I don't want delegation or delegate programs to create is a difference between high context delegates and also high context individuals who also participate, right? And we need to sort of recognize that participation as a whole, not only within that sort of small subset.
Yeah, I see how the liquid nature of blockchain leans towards representative democracy in that you can not have to be stuck to a term. You can say, you know what, I agree with your opinion here, I agree with that person's opinion on this proposal. You could even just vote for yourself. You could represent your own opinion, and that's one of the benefits. I wanted to get your opinion on do you need to have a formal delegation program or incentive for that culture to exist? Or could it organically occur? Does it organically occur? And I'll start with Sinkas.
Yeah. So in terms of a delegation program, it has to do with how governance is set up, like the contracts themselves, whether they allow for delegation of the token. So it's more of a technical question rather than the incentives and if they're aligned and everything. In terms of paying delegates to do their job, like having an incentive program for delegates, or as I like to call it, just compensation, right? It's not an incentive, you're just paying them to do their thing. I think it's something that, as you mentioned, Arlen, it's about more, right now as it is, it's more about meeting quorum and making sure that we can get proposals passed, especially in cases where the DAOs actually control the underlying protocol and there needs to be like technical upgrades and things like that for the protocol to function properly. But ideally, you'd want them not just to do that. And as L2B, for example, as a delegate, we are participating in some delegate incentive program, delegate compensation, and we are getting paid. And one of the things that we're pushing for is that the metric for getting paid versus not getting paid should not just be you voted for all the proposals, you participated in the vote. It should be you were part of the discussion, you offered feedback, you offered alternatives, you facilitated discussion and reached out to other people to get their opinions. You do your duties as someone who's been trusted with making decisions. And part of that is also, for example, overseeing the correct execution of proposals. Oftentimes we see the standard right now in DAOs is if you get the money and you don't run away, you've done a good job. Right? It's a very low standard. But that's kind of like something that is work, right? If I have to spend time looking over a proposal and deciding it, that's one part. But if I have to go back and see, are they executing as they said they would? Is the money going to the right places? Have they misused the funds? Have they just embezzled it and kept it for their own sake? That's something that takes a bit of work, digging, following up. And if I'm not getting paid to do it, why do it? And if I'm not doing it, then who does it?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Like what you've basically outlined is a very clear sort of role and a job in a DAO, right? And I think there's a bit of misunderstanding between the whole, like, okay, I'm getting paid to do actual work, which is performing a duty, right? I can attest, I've seen you guys in the forums, you provide such great feedback and you sort of expand and, that's how, and I think it's a great, and we should have people getting paid for performing those duties. But I do have an issue with other people who don't provide the additional context. They don't question new ideas, or they just go with the supermajority. I have issues with that.
Yeah, the popularity contest
Yeah, it is.
is tough to beat. So we have an audience, Chalda, I'm thinking it's possible that the next professional delegate for Marinade is sitting somewhere here. What would you want to see? What would you, as a Marinade core member and as a Marinade community member, want to see in a really good delegate?
All right. Maybe I would like a bit like start for the previous question, as that for us we are thinking about growing organically on having the delegates, and at start we were not thinking about to have that's a pet position kind of, or have some incentives and try it out how it will go. From that we hope that organically we will find out the people that will be appealed of being able to more have bigger power to more direct the DAO, find out the ways, or being with that power being more interested in what's happening in the space. And for us would be people that are into the staking, that would be understanding what the ecosystem, how that goes. We are not able to getting all the news and touches, so that way the community can help us to grow, because that would be good for them as well. And back to that, in a way expecting that maybe that person needs to be somehow incentivized, but we haven't got so far. We are kind of the start of the starting line of that let's say experiment, if I may use that term.
So for Sinkas, say someone wants to join L2Beat or be a professional delegate in one of the DAOs that you're participating in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually recently hired someone to join our team because the work has just been getting too much, and it was actually troubling to find someone to do what we do. Not because the work is difficult. I could probably teach someone to do it in a matter of 6 months. It's more about getting context. What you said earlier about having high context delegates. It's about understanding where the DAO is, what the discussions that have led us to where we are now, what they were about, what problems were we trying to solve, what problems occurred when we're trying to solve some others. For example, one very low-hanging thing, like as an example, is, as I mentioned earlier, for example, if you're paying a delegate to oversee an initiative, a good solution, why don't we hire like an oversight committee? But then who oversees that? It has to be like the delegate. And ultimately, if you start digging into who does this job, theoretically it's the token holders, right? If you're giving me decision-making power and I vote on something that is stupid and it's not working, you as a token holder say, no, you're not making good decisions. I'll take my voting power away and delegate it to someone else. Oftentimes that does not happen.
Redelegations is like a huge problem, right? So most of the time, delegations are one way. We've actually seen, I've observed things in the community where a high-profile delegate will be like, hey, like I've done 2 years of delegation, thank you, I don't want to do this anymore, and they still hold like 3 or 4 million sort of tokens, and so like even fundamentally from a technical level, like at least in Ethereum, like the delegate function is one way. There's nothing where you can be like revoke or I want to delegate with an expiry, so it's only delegated for a certain amount of time.
Expiring delegations create the other problem that if they expire and they don't get redelegated, you have a hard time reaching quorum.
Right.
Optimism is toying with the idea of redelegation, right? You delegate to me, I stop being a delegate, I can redelegate my voting power to someone else who I know is active and does this.
Yeah, people have been talking, I think some of the chats, was it like ranked choice delegation, was it? Like, so if you have some sort of cascading primitive, so if I can delegate to 1, 2, 3, if 1 doesn't vote, it goes to 2, then to 3, but then you have another problem, which is like, well, if A goes to B, B goes to C, C goes to A, then we've got like an infinite loop.
Yes.
And then that also has this computational limit, depending on what chain you're operating on as well. So again, I think if anything, like these are sort of the problems that we are exploring in delegation. It's a ripe space.
Yeah, but to answer your question, I think the easiest and hardest at the same time way for someone to become a professional delegate is to get involved. And it's the easiest since you just have to show up, participate in calls, read up on the forums, get some context on the DAO. Obviously, you need to bring in some sort of skill set or just determination and hard work. Like, for example, overseeing initiatives and digging deep and doing the work that ZachXBT, as you mentioned in your presentation, also does, is needed in DAOs. But it just takes time, and oftentimes that time could be used elsewhere where you would get compensated. Because it's a slippery slope to get to a point where you can be solidly embedded in a DAO and actually get paid for it. And in my talk later, I'm planning on touching on that subject of what is the perception of how a DAO is and how it works, and this whole like kumbaya environment versus what it actually feels like.
It's adversarial. Actually, just building on like I guess a point that I made in my talk was like how can we sort of create more incentives for governance tokens? So one DAO that I've observed, they've created like a whistleblower program. So to your point, when funds are misallocated, some DAOs are employing a strategy where if any member from the community is able to identify and concretely prove that those funds were misappropriated, well, they are entitled to the clawback in a percentage and they earn governance tokens, which is like a great way to get involved. And that builds your trust as someone who's highly aligned with the community.
Yeah, we recently voted for such a program in Arbitrum. And
that's what I was referencing.
Yeah, but the problem with that is, you have to be on, good terms with other delegates and contributors. Not to be a people pleaser, but because otherwise you'll have a hard time, again, reaching quorum and making decisions in the DAO. And as L2B, we've often taken the role of the bad guy, calling things out.
Which I think is important. Like I think
it is, but it's hard.
Yeah, emotionally and mentally.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I agree with everything you guys have said as far as finding someone that's good for a delegate. I think the core skill set you need to have is reliability. Like you need to be doing the work, reading up, showing up. But really that barrier is low enough where anybody looking for a role in the ecosystem can look as an opportunity. As someone who likes to make DAOs, I like to start off these experiments a lot. One of the common threads I'm hearing in all of the answers is that you need to have incentivized delegates. You need to have some compensation. I agree with that. Although I do have examples of voting where I vote, if there's an incentive, I vote just to make sure I get the incentive. And that's not as a professional delegate. I'm referring to Jupiter as the DAO, where I just make sure I vote so I can make sure I get the incentive. Now, if de facto we think, delegates are good and we need to have these programs, when someone is developing their DAO and their tokenomics, how do they figure out the portion that's carved out for incentive programs? Is it part of the tokenomics, where you're asking the delegates to believe in the dream that this token is going to accrue in value? Or is it revenue from some sort of fees? Is there a particular percentage that makes sense? And I think it'll make sense for Sinkas to go first, just because you work in this space, and then I'd love to hear from Chalda.
Yeah, so oftentimes that kind of incentive program for delegates is they get set up, and the money that comes from typically the treasury of the DAO. So unless the DAO is very steered, like for example Optimism, where the foundation kind of like designs everything, and delegates are there mostly to rubber stamp at this point, because they believe in progressive decentralization and going one step at a time. Whereas on the other hand of the spectrum, Arbitrum, they are like fully decentralized. It's this example of just taking your kid and throwing it in the pool and they'll figure out how to swim. Or they'll drown, but that's another thing. So they come from the treasury typically. It's not just necessarily earmarked from the token allocation, the airdrop and everything for that specific reason. Typically most token allocations just include a part for like the DAO or community, and that sits on a treasury that's governed by a contract if we're talking about DAO. And that's the kind of like inherent conflict of interest, where delegates will come together, discuss about how they can pay themselves to do the work of the delegates. So this is kind of like has been, when we're discussing about ethical participation in DAOs and not voting for your own interests and everything like that, delegates necessarily have to vote for an incentive program for it to be established, because quorum needs to be reached and the money needs to be moved from the treasury. Without delegate voting for it, it won't happen. But after that happens, and if it happens, we typically have a program manager, someone running the program, where they look at the voting history of delegates, for example, or any other qualifying factors, and they distribute payments based on that. This is generally the approach. But for example, in ZK Sync, a more recently formed DAO, they are looking into approach of TPPs, or token programs. And the idea is to have automatic transactions from smart contracts directly. So you set up the program, you say, we want to incentivize delegates, you set up the parameters, and it does executes automatically from the treasury without the interfering of a program manager or something like that. Which I think is like an interesting approach, making more automation and making use of smart contracts and blockchain more.
Yeah, I know it's a tough number to ascribe, but like, is it, if we're looking at the totality of tokenomics, what feels like the right amount that goes towards this program?
Yeah, it's a very difficult. So on Arbitrum, I happen to know, I'm part of the multisig that distributes those payments to delegates. And every month we distribute around 250 to 300,000 to the top 50 delegates. And let's say that happens for a year, that's a little less than 3 million. And the treasury holds 2-point-something billion. But it's held in the native token, so the actual money is less if you account for liquidity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a small portion comparatively. Like, we could theoretically have an incentive program for the next 10 years without making a dent in the treasury.
Okay, so we're talking about something like less than 1% of the overall supply?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Shalda, how are you guys thinking about this in Marinade so far?
Yeah, I would like split that kind of in practical in two parts. First is like the voting power or proposals for DAO, like where the next development will be steered, or how to like configure the system. With that way, we are thinking of like starting with no like delegation like payments. The other part that we have is like MNDE used for like delegate or to influence delegation power of the for the souls that we are placing on validators, and there that's like incentive program that we had is like when you decide to use your MNDA power to find out the best best validator that you believe in, that you are getting back a like portion of MNDE. With that, that flow could be like just cut through the delegator. So having some percentage of, if somebody is like able to find out members that believes in him, that he knows how to find the right delegator, then and that we haven't got to any numbers. That's just some cut would be like go through the flow to the delegates and with the rest to the delegate.
That's a more dynamic assigned amount for each delegate.
Yeah, and that's like kind of the practically use how we use the MND tokens on that specific case. It's that one focused stuff where you can take your MND, how you can use it. Nothing like general idea how we like be voting about how the delegates will be paid. That is the concrete use case we have and we are covering.
So, Arnold, when I invited you to join this panel, you had told me, well, I'm not so bullish on delegates.
No, pay delegation programs.
So now that we've discussed it a bit more and we've heard about, maybe a set amount being, low 1% of the overall supply or a dynamic version.
I think it's fair to clarify. So, like, how we frame delegation programs, like we've covered that delegates do a good job and they need to be paid in some fashion. I would say that, like, what we call that job or the role that they're doing, it's not actually delegation. They're doing a job, and we need to sort of frame that in a different way. And the reason why I have this sort of opinion is, like I said earlier, like, what about the people who are also voting and performing duties that aren't paid delegates? And I'm trying to sort of include them in the sort of like macro way of how we can incentivize them fairly. Now, in terms of like the paid delegation programs that you guys participate in, I think that's like the role of some sort of committee or a council that is, you're voted in to do a very specific job, and it's great and you should get paid for it. But yeah, I'm just trying to be inclusive in terms of the other people who are also performing similar duties that
They just don't happen to be part of...
and because that creates like a weird thing, right? Because if people aren't motivated or they can see people getting paid in a particular manner and they're performing the same duties and they're not getting like incentives for it, well, that creates a disincentive for them to put forward ideas and contribute. So we want to try and create a fair playing field for everyone to share in that equally. And when people are doing jobs that are much more than us, such as like providing the deep insight and technical sort of accountability, yeah, pay them more because they deserve it.
There's a culture that started in Ethereum with the Curve protocol and involved in something called the Curve Wars with gauges and bribery markets. We have something similar now starting off in Solana, where if you have governance tokens and you really don't vote much or you're not a professional delegate, there's a marketplace where somebody else purchases the right to vote with your tokens. So it's a way for you to make money off of your voting right without having to vote. What do you guys think about bribery markets?
It's funny that you mentioned that. Up until yesterday, we used to be the #1 delegate in Arbitrum by voting power. And yesterday, I was checking, and we are now the second because the #1 is lobby.fi. And
Yes, I saw that recently.
It's
It's
a
crazy.
bribing market. It's basically a voting block of about 20-something million votes, and you can purchase to have it vote your way. I think it creates problems, but at the same time, I'm not fully against it, simply because for many things, one is you can meet quorum that way, and the second, most importantly, is that typically, it depends on what you're trying to bribe, and this is a very thin line. Like, what kind of outcomes are you trying to achieve using that voting block? So this is why I'm not really against it. And for example, you can have someone who has very like skin in the game, a very big protocol on a chain, and they need to go against a proposal that would dilute their interest in the chain. It would not represent what they want to do in the chain. But they are a very big protocol. They're contributing a lot to the chain's growth, activity, fees even, and revenue. So they should be, in a way, if they're spending money, they're putting their money where their mouth is, and they're casting more votes than they have. I think they could also just go to the open market and buy the tokens, but that would, put a lot of more cost in their hands, though that voting power would remain in their hands. I think it's an interesting side effect of having liquid democracy, that people can just, have a lot of tokens, especially insiders and investors. They have millions of tokens. Some of them do not delegate them at all for fear of regulatory backfiring. The landscape is kind of unclear. So they are trying, to make money based on their holdings without themselves directly, either selling them or participating in governance themselves. So I think it's a very thin line. I think we'll still have to see how it would develop. For me, the most important thing is making sure that the protocol is secure from governance attacks using that block. And as long as you can have some safeguards against it, for example, most protocols right now have security councils that, in the compound situation that you mentioned, I think earlier, is, some people dubbed it a governance attack. Others could say that it was just governance, right? They had a lot of voting power. They didn't bribe anyone. It was their own, and they just put a proposal. They voted for it. So it's a very thin line. Why, if we're censoring that, then where do we draw the line? So this is, for me, an interesting thing to see unfold in how it will affect. And in Arbitrum, for example, that we're very active in, it happened very recently, so I'm looking forward to see how it will unfold. But I don't have like a strong opinion against or for it.
I think, the markets are going to be markets, right? Like, it's going to happen, like, if anything, it creates better motivations for protocol developers to design better guards and make these systems more resilient.
Mm-hmm.
For me, to be honest, I'm not an expertise on this topic. I can now talk really just for me as a contributor to DAO that I believe in. I'm with this a bit afraid about, I have fear, but as was said here, that's market is market. Maybe that's a good way to find out how the DAO could be managed.
I think one interesting point to add, in your talk you did mention you did have an additional layer where there was an additional realm which acted as a realm with a veto power, and I think most on-chain governance systems have some sort of circuit breaker. So I think with if these systems express themselves in a malicious manner, there are safeguards, or at least people who have thought about them have that.
Optimism, for example, has this anti-capture commission, which is basically a group of the top delegates that they control an additional voting block of about 10 million. I think they are either the biggest or the second biggest delegate, like the anti-capture commission. So the goal of that is to amplify the existing delegate's voice in the case of a governance attack. So that voting block does not participate in votes like everyday things, but in case there's suddenly an insider or massive voting block that gets spawned through bribery, for example, that delegates could vote against it, but if the sum of their votes is still less than the voting, they could also mobilize the anti-capture commission voting power to vote against that rogue voting block. But yeah, it's
fun.
Yeah, it's fun because it's very subjective. Where do you draw the line, whether that's malicious or not? For me, anything that would hurt the funds of users in that protocol or chain, that's malicious. If you're attacking the treasury, I think that's fair game. But if you're trying to attack the funds of the users on the chain, let's say, for example, in Arbitrum, the DAO actually, the contracts of the DAO, the governor, controls the protocol. And that's something that most people don't realize. It's not just the money sitting on the treasury. That, let's say you manage to steal the 2 billion Arbitrum treasury. It's not going to be worth 2 billion, right? The moment you steal it, the market is going to dump, liquidity is not going to be there, you're going to get a few million. So it's not worth it because that's, like, you need 200 million voting power to achieve quorum on your own. So you're not going to get that out of governance attack. But what you could make a governance attack in is the bridge, where it's controlled by the protocol, so it could steal all user funds that are locked in the bridge. And we're talking about, I think, 17 billion or 12, something in that range. And it's not native token, it's USDC, it's Ethereum, it's many different tokens. So that's very lucrative. So right now, theoretically, and in theory, it's not like the cost of that attack is probably way higher if you account for liquidity issues. But if you spend about 300 million, you could attack the bridge that holds about 10 billion. But it's optics, it's regulatory, it's the cost itself that is preventative.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Even though we call it bribery markets, it's distinctly different than traditional bribes in governance, in that those are covert. You don't know that somebody's being bribed, whereas here, it's all super transparent. You can see it ahead of time. In the case of Arbitrum being attacked, everybody would be able to sell their Arbitrum if they could see that this bribe market was happening.
Until we get shielded voting and we don't know what's happening in those early stages, which is like, a case for and against that, right? Like,
On chain, for the time being, you cannot.
yeah,
you cannot have
at
it.
the moment. But like
A
there is
ZK
lots of people are saying, oh, we don't think that it's actually a good idea to submit the votes because it's going to, sway people towards a particular opinion.
Yeah.
As LTB, we
Right.
tend to vote late for that reason.
Yeah.
We don't want to influence people with our decision, but yeah.
I think bribery markets are inevitable. I used to be very active in Ethereum Classic, and this was a chain that was famous for getting 51% attacked. And a very similar bribery market was that you could purchase hash power of any type of hashing algorithm. So it was analogous to a bribery market. Just you were renting somebody's hash power. So I think it's inevitable that that's going to occur. How are we doing for time, sir? Okay. So thank you very much for joining the panel, and thank you for listening.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.